Baobab Brilliance, Perspectives on Audacity, features Black women who are the embodiment of don't speak about it, be about it. Black women who write the vision and make it plain. I'm your host, Makiyah Moody. Let's get into it.
Veronica Brooks-Uy, welcome to Baobab Brilliance, Perspectives on Audacity.
Thank you very much. I am so excited to be here, Makiyah.
I'm excited that you're excited. And let me tell the people why. Because by way of introduction, Veronica and I met years ago when I lived in New Orleans and she lived in New Orleans, and she was holding things down at the State Charter School Association as policy director. And after working for years together, she became my work spouse. And then she went on to create two of my most cherished little humans, Thurgood and Octavia. And she's the gift that keeps on giving. And so I'm excited that you listeners have the chance to bask in her brilliance as part of this conversation.
What an introduction. Thank you. And let me just say that Thurgood and Octavia love their Auntie Mac. They ask about you all the time. And we are so blessed to have you in our lives.
You let them know that I'll be coming for some ice cream in the next couple of months. All right. So I typically like to ask guests on the pod about a word or phrase that describes how they're entering into this energy exchange we are about to have. So what's your word or phrase that describes how you're entering in?
Yeah, I love this question. And I wasn't sure what exactly it would be when I read it earlier. But now that I'm here with you, I think the word that's coming to mind is just ease. It's just always so easy to talk to you. And I just always find myself reflecting on what you've said or something that we've talked about. And yeah, I'm just really excited for this conversation and the ease with which it flows.
Awesome. I have a vision that it's going to be like a love fest. So get ready, folks. So I have the pleasure of knowing you and who you are, but others may not. So we contain multitudes. Can you tell me about yours? And this is a very expansive question, but basically, who is Veronica Dublin Brooks-Uy?
Yeah, I think that she is her own person, right? She has had a variety of experiences, all of which have made her who she is today, and for better or for worse, but here we are. So I would say, let's see, if we're gonna start from the beginning, I was born and raised in a very small town in rural Virginia. It's called Nathalie, Virginia. My first date with my now husband, I remember he asked me, "Oh, where are you from?" And I told him, and he's, "Oh, how many people live there? What's the population?" And I said, "Oh, I think it's about 100, maybe a little less, maybe closer to 95." And he's, "Oh, wow, 100,000 people is actually quite a significant town or city." And I was like, "Oh, no, 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 literally 100 people." So yeah, I grew up in a very small area. I spent a lot of time with my maternal grandparents, Mildred and Samuel Wilson. They had a farm where they grew tobacco and they had hogs, and lots of other stuff, but those were the two primary things. My grandmother was also a domestic worker, so she did a lot of house cleaning for folks in the area. And yeah, I would describe us as being very working class and at times maybe even poor, depending on the phase of my life. But I never really truly felt that way. I just remember growing up and always, especially on Sundays, there would be people at my grandmother's house who would come and she would have this giant dinner and she would feed people. And I would be like, who is this? Who is this person who is here? I've never seen this man in my life. And it would turn out to be like a neighbor or someone from church or wherever, but people knew that my grandparents were going to provide, that they were going to have a hearty meal, and that they would be good company and have a loving, warm, kind word for them, that they would always feel welcomed. And I think that really shaped who I try to be. So even though I have since moved away from Nathalie and now I live in Raleigh, North Carolina, I still try and be the person or model myself after the person that I think my grandmother and my grandfather would want me to be. I got into the University of Virginia. I got a full ride when I was in high school and was not very excited about it because that was not where I wanted to go to school. But the other schools that I had gotten into, we couldn't afford. So I'm off to UVA I went. And it was like a really life-changing experience for me. There was so much that I learned. There were so many people that I met. My eyes were open to just innumerable experiences and opportunities that I just couldn't even fathom before. And one of the things that I'll always be really grateful for is I actually took a class on rural poverty in America. And that class really helped me understand my upbringing and where I was from and the people I grew up with. Because up until that point, I think I carried a lot of internalized shame and bias for folks in kind of small rural places, and just realizing that so much of the struggles that I had seen and that I had experienced, those were individual experiences, right? That those were systemic and in a lot of cases were purposeful, right? A system trying to keep people down, trying to keep people voting against their own interest. And I think that was really eye-opening for me. And in that class, I also learned a lot about education, particularly in rural America, and the educational discrepancies and disparities that exist in our country. And even though both of my parents had been educators, they had always told me, don't go into education. We want more for you. They had again, decent wages, were able to make a decent life for myself and my brother. We never had a lot, but I think my parents wanted more for my brother and myself than that. And so really felt like going into education would keep us from being able to do that. And so they had always told us not to go into education. But the more I learned about educational inequities, the more I felt compelled towards education. And so I ended up applying for Teach for America, which is as I imagine most folks are familiar with, is an AmeriCorps program that places college graduates in low income school districts, and especially in teaching roles that are hard to fill. And so I became a middle school science teacher out in Louisiana in a town about 45 minutes outside of Baton Rouge. And it was very similar to where I had grown up. Again, it really helped me realize how much of the struggles that our folks face. And I mean that in terms of rural folks, Black folks, impoverished folks, right? There's so much intersectionality there. But so much of what vulnerable, disenfranchised people face is systemic. And I really loved working in my classroom. I loved my students, but I felt like this desire to want to have an impact beyond the classroom. And so that's what eventually led me to graduate school where I got a public policy degree, which then ended up with me back in Louisiana, but this time working at the Department of Education. And then together with you, Makiyah, the Louisiana Charter School Association, and eventually to where I work now, which is the National Association of Charter School Authorizers. And yeah, all of this is to say that when people ask me, "Oh, why do you do this work?" It it's hard to even know where to start. right? Because I feel like I've been being led down this path and being prepped to try and have an impact in this field and this work since I was born. So yeah, I don't know. That's was a very long-winded story, but when you ask me about containing multitudes, that's where my mind goes.
Thank you. I think that even though I've known you for so long, I think there are little nuggets in there that I either forgot or wasn't aware of. And so thank you for sharing them as far as context and to also paint a picture as to why your heart is in education. I'm curious. I know that as policy director at the State Charter School Association in Louisiana, that you spent a lot of time in Baton Rouge and in legislative sessions and making the case for changes to the system that would be impactful for students across the state. What's been the hardest system to influence or shift? And what's made it so resistant in the context of education?
Yeah. I think the thing that I still struggle with, and that is the hardest to get across to people, is that all of the children are our children, right? And so there's so much division within education. It's so political, and there are so many instances where people dig in on one side or the other. And I find myself asking, why do we even have sides? What are we talking about here? There's a lot of, even within the public education system, there's a lot of kind of us versus them talk, charters versus traditional public school. And if you're looking across public versus private, there's just, again, there just seem to be so many factions. And I really struggle with that because I think we need to be as kumbaya as it sounds, and maybe it even sounds a little naive to some people. I truly do think that we need to start thinking about all of the kids in our country as our kids, right? Because what happens to the students impacts all of us, right? Having a quality education, in my opinion, should be considered a public good, right? We know when kids don't get a quality education, sure, there's an economic impact, but there's also a lot of social impacts in the ways that we see incarceration numbers going up, in the way that we see people being able to provide for themselves. I think there's a spiritual and moral implication that happens when we don't make sure that all of our students feel seen and heard, and that they have a basic level of understanding of literacy and numeracy and deep thinking skills. So, yeah, I really hate that we find ourselves, even now, after all of the data, all of the evidence that points to what happens when every kid doesn't get a quality education, we're still having these really petty, pathetic fights about public versus private versus charter versus whatever. And I really think that's a shame.
Are there any examples in your work where you think the education field is playing too small and needs to be more audacious? And what would the example be?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think there are a lot of areas where that's the case, but I have a good friend, Ebony Durham, who leads a charter school in Chicago. And she was on a podcast recently, and the person interviewing her said something along the lines of, nowadays, schools are expected to be everything to everybody. And her response was, we may not always achieve that, but I'm going to try. And so I think that one of the places that maybe we're playing a bit too small is just what can be provided through the education system. Now, I want to caveat that with the fact that the resources need to be there, the funding needs to be there, right? I'm not suggesting that people in schools should be asked to do more and more without actually having the resources and the capacity to do it. But what if we put the resources in? What if we added more social workers and more tutors and like some of these folks that we know can have such a big influence on kids and therefore on families as well? Why aren't we trying to do more instead of less? And I do think that we should be having more conversations about how can we embed more social services into the education system for family and students. Why aren't schools more acting more as like community centers and really inviting whole communities in and not just being a place where kind of kids come in the morning and leave in the afternoon? I would love to see schools really be the anchors of communities again. And I hear the pushback of some of that is because we're moving away from neighborhood schools and charter schools are part of that moving away and whatnot. And I get that. And I think we can let that be the case, but it doesn't have to be the case. And so, yeah, I think that's something that's really inspired me recently is just thinking about the folks like Ebony who are doing this work and who are really asking, what can I do for my community? What can I do for my kids? And really seeing it as her job, right? Yeah.
Thank you. Your experiences that you've had in your career have focused a lot on equity and outcomes in public education, whether that's through better authorizing practices and how charter schools come to be and are monitored, or as an educator and your firsthand experience as a teacher. And I'm wondering, with those experiences, where do you think that equity work in education has been co-opted or diluted? And how do we reclaim its original intent? I think that your example of Ebony is related to this question also, in that schools should be places where all students have their needs met based on whatever those needs are. So I'm thinking of differentiated instruction. Every student doesn't need the same thing, but there should be enough of whatever is needed for that student to thrive and flourish. And yet, I think that our country has been going backwards on like how to lean into equity within the educational space. So I'm curious, given your vantage point and the experiences that you have, yeah, I guess maybe I'll rephrase the question actually. Do you think that equity work in education has been co-opted or diluted? And then if so, how do we reclaim it?
I think this is a tough question because I think, first of all, I think equity means different things to different people, especially in this space, right? I think for a lot of folks, when they think about equity, what they're talking about are the differences in test scores and other student outcomes like graduation rates and college matriculation, et cetera. And then for other folks, when they're thinking about equity, it's a more inclusive term, right? And they're thinking about outcomes beyond just academic ones. And I think that in this space, again, going back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of factions and things becoming so divided, I think the problem is that a lot of times folks might be, if we think about it as a spectrum, I think folks tend to find themselves on one end or the other. And I think more folks probably need to come towards the middle. I truly do believe that academic metrics and measures still matter, right? I think that it's really easy to say, oh, test scores are BS and standardized testing is evil. And I just don't believe that to be true. I think tests can absolutely give you information. What you do with that information matters a lot, and I think we have to be careful on how we use the information, but I do believe that standardized tests have a place and that that information that we gather from those types of tests are useful. And at the same time, I also believe fully that there are other measures that we should be looking at and ensuring that we think about when we think about equity. Do kids feel seen? Do they have a sense of identity and purpose? Are they leaving school with deep thinking skills and critical thinking skills? I think there's a lot of stuff that goes into equity. And yet, a lot of people out there are just thinking about it in one way. When I was in graduate school, I had this professor who said once, I think he was probably quoting someone else, but I don't remember who. But he used to say, what gets measured matters, but not everything that matters is measurable. And I just think about that a lot when I approach my work. I think that if it really matters to us, and we think it's important, we should try and measure it. There are some things that are going to be harder to measure than others. And I'm not suggesting that we try and put a metric with every single thing. But I do think it's important for us to be led by the evidence and to be led by the data and also led by what kids and families are telling us. And yeah, I think when I think about equity, I don't know if I think it's been co-opted necessarily, but I do think that we should be thinking about it in a much more comprehensive and robust way.
I'm struck by something you said about people on the left and on the right, and that perhaps more people need to move to the center. So, as a follow up to that kind of visual that you provided us with, and what it means to turn towards each other and find middle ground, how do you decide when to work within systems versus pushing from the outside?
Yeah. And just to clarify, when I talked about that spectrum, I'm not necessarily talking about the left politically or the right politically. I'm just really talking about being on a broad spectrum of differing opinions, whatever those may be. I think that often even happens within a political party or within an organization. But I think your question is a good one. When do you try and find compromise versus perhaps trying to break the status quo and do something a little bit different? I don't know that I have a great answer in terms of if there is a surefire, this is the line, this is where, or this is how I make those types of decisions. I really try my best to approach them individually because I do think that there's always so much nuance. And a lot of times we as a country, we as people generally are not great with nuance, right? I think we like to think that things are totally black and white and that it's things are right or wrong. And I just think that a lot of times that's not the reality. And so really trying to understand what is the situation in front of me? What is the context? What is the history? Who are the people involved? What are their backgrounds? What's the context there? Really trying to understand the situation that is before me. And then it feels sometimes a little bit easier to know, yeah, how to really work within or not. But I think you really have to understand the full context of what you're doing and what you're working within when making those types of choices.
Yeah. And I imagine that your identity informs some of the choices that you make. I'm reminded of the start of this conversation where you grounded us in Nathalie, Virginia, and the time that you spent with your maternal grandparents and what that community was like, some of the lived experiences that you've had. Can you offer up a moment when your lived experience gave you clarity that the data set or the policy alone couldn't? I'm thinking maybe of, I'm not sure if there's examples from your current role with charter authorizing or your time navigating policy in Louisiana, where your lived experiences were perhaps more robust than the PowerPoint slides that the consultants may have been presenting to you about issue X.
Yeah, I think that's often the case, right? I think that I don't think it's possible for me to come into a situation without bringing in my identity and my lived experiences and that influencing how I think about things. One experience that I had when we were in Louisiana and I was working at the Louisiana Department of Education, one of the things that I won't say responsible for, it wasn't just me, but there were lots of people who were involved. But one of the things that I was engaged in was reading charter applications and then interviewing applicants to understand if they had the capacity and experience and skill set to actually run a school. Because then we would give a recommendation to the state board about whether or not we believed that that group that was applying for a school would actually be able to run a high quality school for kids. And I think that I can think of at least one experience. I imagine there were probably more, but I can think of at least one experience where there was this group of folks, majority Black, from a more rural part of the state applying for a school. And I think on paper, their application perhaps did not fit the typical standard that that had been set out. And yet their passion for this community and their ability to really understand what the families and the students needed was just so evident. And I made a case for, hey, I know that this group is a little bit right on the edge in terms of whether or not we would recommend them to have a school. And I think that they do have the capacity. They just need the resources and perhaps more connections to really get it off the ground. And again, without going into a ton of kind of technical and boring details, we did end up recommending them to have the school, but really pointed them in the direction of, hey, you need to be talking to these organizations. You need to try and connect with some organizations that are going to be able to get you some high quality teachers, especially in these roles that are hard to fill out in this particular part of the state. Just like really helping them think through some of the spots where they were going to have challenges, but also recognizing that they were fully capable of addressing and overcoming those challenges, especially because they had run into many a challenge before and overcome those, right? And I can see that as someone who was Black and from a rural space, we know how to get things done. We've always had to. And so I think that sometimes people can just see the deficits. If you don't have that lived experience, I think it's really easy to focus on the deficits and not the asset. And I think that I was able to really highlight some of the assets that other people were overlooking. Yeah.
That sounds on brand for you, Veronica. To find the assets and the sunshine. Also, I have two more questions for you. This series is called Baobab Brilliance Perspectives on Audacity because the baobab tree is considered the tree of life. It's resistant to fire and plays a key role in the ecosystems that it's a part of. And I think that the way Black women show up in the world is like baobab tree energy. And so, my question for you is, where are you being called to be more audacious right now?
Oh, I love this question. I think if we think about the baobab tree, the thing that you mentioned that really stands out is that they provide food and shelter for a variety of different animals in the ecosystem. And I think that in my life right now, I am being called to try and be the shelter and the nourishment for other folks who are coming behind me. I don't really think of myself as someone that folks necessarily look up to or a mentor or like that's just I think of myself as being far too goofy and someone who has not figured out her own life yet. So what would I offer to other people? And yet there have been multiple occasions now where I have just shared something going on in my life and how I'm trying to navigate something or a challenge that I'm facing. And I have had people, particularly young women, particularly young Black women, reach out and say, "Thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you for being honest, for being vulnerable. Here's what I'm dealing with." Sometimes it's something similar, sometimes it's something not quite the same, but adjacent to the thing that I was struggling with. And yeah, just being a listening ear and providing some thoughts and sharing my own experiences. And I try not to give a lot of unsolicited advice, but if someone asks me, like, "Hey, what are your thoughts here?" I share. I think that's maybe the phase of life that I'm entering into is being someone who can provide some reflections on what I've experienced and how I've navigated the world, and hopefully it's helpful. Again, I'm not always sure how it possibly could be because I feel very still in the thick of trying to figure it all out. But again, the universe seems to be sending folks my way continuously. So clearly there's something there, and I'm just trying to lean into that more.
The good news is that we never figure it all out. Well, you're free. You're free, Veronica. We'll never figure it out. We just get incremental steps where things may get better. So I have been sitting with this idea of joy and how to bring more joy into my life with intention because the news, world events, just how people can sometimes be trashy to each other. It all is a total energy suck and can sometimes put me into a spiral of despair. I'm curious about your practices for inciting joy.
Yeah. I think the little things, right? I think it so often we think of life as being like these really made up of these really big moments. And obviously those exist and will continue to exist and certainly I think help define a life. But I think the little stuff really that makes up your life, right? There's so many more of the little things than there are the big things. And I think that with joy, you have to take the same approach. Yeah, it'd be great to win the lottery, to have a really big infusion of joy. But until that happens, I want to continue to curate and work in some of the littler things as well. I think for me, that looks like leaning into being silly and leaning into play. I am an avid New York Times games player, so I really like the Wordle and I really like playing Connection, and I'm a big nerd. But those playing those games every day infuse a little bit of joy. I love a good sour gummy candy. And certainly that's not all I eat. I try and focus on the good stuff, the vegetables, the proteins, yada. I also make sure I have a little bag of gummy worms with me wherever I go, and I'm gonna enjoy that. Yeah, I think that, at least for me, shifting my focus to some of the smaller moments and the smaller pleasures, if you will, it has been really helpful because if I'm just waiting on the big moments, like the big trip or the big meetup, whatever it might be, like that's a long wait, right? Because at least in my household, that only happens once a year. What are we doing the other 364 days? Right.
So
Yeah, that's how I'm trying to curate joy.
I didn't hear you say K-pop Demon Hunters.
Yes, though, right? My kids introduced us to K-pop Demon Hunters, and those songs are a bop. So sometimes in the van, we have a little sing-along party. Makiyah, you got to be part of that when you were here.
Glorious.
Mhm. It is absolutely a joy infuser. Again, that kind of silliness and leaning into play. And my kids have been so helpful in that, right? I am not naturally someone I think who is drawn to play. And having a 4-year old and a 7-year-old, though, whether you want to play or not, they're going to make you. And so having them drag me outside to play on the swings and blow bubbles or build a sand castle, like it's been really lovely to see the world through their eyes and to get to partake in that kind of unfiltered joy that I think kids are very good at.
Right on. So my closing question, similar to how we started, and I asked for a word or a phrase to describe how you were entering in. What's a word or a phrase to describe how you are leaving our conversation?
I'm gonna stick with the word "ease." I'm looking at the clock and realizing that it's been an hour, and that's amazing to me because it feels like we've only been talking for a few minutes. It's always just so easy to speak with you and to, yeah, like, to be reflective with you, and so I just thank you so much for what you're doing. It's so invigorating to hear Black women are thriving. And I think you do such a good job of highlighting that we as Black women are such an interesting group, right? We are so diverse. We're not all the same. And yet I feel like we are able to support one another and we all have these similarities in some of our experiences and we lift each other up. And I just really love the community of Black women and what you're doing in terms of highlighting how we're all navigating this world differently, but yeah, thriving nevertheless.
Hmm, awesome. Thank you for joining me, Veronica. It is always a pleasure to share time and space with you.
Yes, same. Thank you, my friend.